The air was heavy with the scent of hay and the faint rustle of leaves under the early morning sun. Suddenly, a sharp sound cut through the quiet, a vicious kick that sent the horse stumbling back, its eyes wide with pain and confusion. From the shadows, the owner watched, frozen in a moment of shock that quickly turned to fury. He saw everything. And he wasn't about to let it go. The ranch was a sanctuary of peace, where every morning felt like a blessing painted in hues of gold. As the first light of dawn crept across the horizon, it kissed the rolling hills and the dew-laden grass, creating a glistening carpet that stretched as far as the eye could see. In the heart of this haven stood a quarter horse, majestic and proud. Its chestnut coat gleamed like polished copper under the early sun, and its dark eyes held a gentle intelligence that spoke of trust and loyalty. The horse moved with a grace that seemed almost ethereal, its powerful muscles rippling with each deliberate step. To its owner, this horse wasn't just an animal, it was a lifelong companion, a partner in the unspoken dance of ranch life. The owner, a middle-aged man with weathered hands and kind eyes, had poured his heart and soul into this ranch and the creatures that called it home. Every plank in the wooden fence surrounding the pasture, every bale of hay stacked neatly in the barn, bore the mark of his care. But none carried more of his love than the horse that now grazed lazily under the soft morning light. This horse was more than a symbol of his hard work, it was a reminder of his late father, who had taught him to respect and cherish these creatures. But peace, no matter how strong, is fragile in the face of envy. Beyond the fence, just a stone's throw away, lived the neighbor. A man whose life was a far cry from the serenity of the ranch, he was a restless soul, consumed by bitterness. His yard was cluttered, the grass overgrown, and the disarray mirrored the chaos within him. From his porch, he often watched the ranch, his eyes narrowing whenever he saw the horse gallop freely or the owner laughing with joy. Jealousy is a powerful poison. For years, the neighbor's resentment had grown, fed by every sight of the thriving ranch and the bond between the owner and his horse. To him, that horse was a symbol of everything he lacked: success, companionship, and peace. The more he watched, the more his envy twisted into something darker, a need to destroy the very thing that reminded him of his failures. That morning, the neighbor lingered near the fence, his eyes locked on the horse. His lips curled into a sneer as the animal approached, blissfully unaware of the malice in his gaze. In his heart, a plan began to form, one fueled by jealousy and spite. He would do something that could never be undone. The quiet of the ranch remained unbroken, but an invisible storm was brewing. The peace of the land and the bond between man and horse were about to be tested in a way no one could have imagined. The neighbor's envy had begun as a faint whisper, an uncomfortable feeling he tried to ignore. But as the days turned to months and the months into years, that whisper grew louder, transforming into a constant roar in his mind. Every glance at the owner's thriving ranch felt like a dagger to his pride, a reminder of everything he believed he could never achieve. It started with subtle acts of bitterness. At first, the neighbor would mutter under his breath whenever he crossed paths with the owner in town. He'd scoff at the fresh produce the owner brought to the local market or roll his eyes when someone complimented the horse's beauty. "It's just a damn horse," he'd grumble, loud enough for others to hear. These remarks, though petty, carried the weight of his growing resentment. As time went on, his bitterness took on more tangible forms. One morning, the owner woke to find the ranch's mailbox smashed, the wooden post splintered as if struck by a heavy object. A week later, the water trough in the pasture was mysteriously overturned, leaving the horse without fresh water until the owner noticed. Though there was no proof, the owner had a sinking feeling that the neighbor was behind these acts. Still, he chose to say nothing, hoping the incidents were isolated. The neighbor's jealousy wasn't limited to sabotage. He'd often be seen lingering near the fence, his arms crossed and a scowl etched into his face. Sometimes, he'd mutter to himself, words too quiet to hear but dark enough to send a chill down anyone's spine. On more than one occasion, the owner caught him staring at the horse, his gaze cold and calculating, as if he were sizing up a rival rather than an innocent animal. The tension between the two men grew thicker with each passing day. The owner's polite greetings were met with silence or a dismissive grunt. When the neighbor did speak, his words dripped with sarcasm and disdain. "Must be nice," he'd sneer, "having everything handed to you on a silver platter." The owner, ever patient, would simply smile and walk away, unwilling to fan the flames of conflict. But the neighbor's resentment refused to be contained. It seeped into his every action, poisoning his thoughts and driving him to darker places. He began to see the horse not as a living creature but as a symbol of everything he hated about the owner. It became an obsession, a target for his misplaced anger and frustration. One night, under the cover of darkness, the neighbor crept closer to the ranch. He stood at the edge of the fence, his breath visible in the cool night air. The horse was resting near the barn, its chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. For a moment, the neighbor hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his mind. But the venom of jealousy coursing through his veins was too strong to resist. He picked up a small rock and hurled it toward the horse, hitting the ground just inches from its hooves. The horse startled, its ears pinning back as it let out a nervous whinny. The sound was enough to wake the owner, who stepped out onto the porch, scanning the darkness. The neighbor froze, his heart pounding in his chest. After a moment, the owner retreated back inside, unaware of the lurking presence just beyond the fence. The neighbor slunk back to his yard, a twisted sense of satisfaction mingling with his lingering fear of being caught. But that night, the seed of his next act of cruelty was planted. His jealousy had festered long enough. Now, he was ready to act, to take something from the owner that he could never replace. The unease in the air was palpable, like the heavy stillness before a storm. The ranch, once a place of peace and harmony, now seemed overshadowed by an invisible threat. The owner could sense it, though he couldn't pinpoint its source. The horse, too, seemed more skittish, its usual calm replaced by a nervous energy. It was as if both man and animal could feel the storm brewing, even if they couldn't see the clouds gathering. The neighbor's envy, his bitterness, and his growing obsession with the horse were all leading to an inevitable breaking point. And though the owner remained unaware of the full extent of the danger, he would soon discover just how far jealousy could drive a man. The storm brewing between the ranch owner and his neighbor reached its inevitable breaking point one fateful evening. The day had started like any other, the golden hues of sunset stretched lazily across the ranch, washing over the fields in warmth. But for the neighbor, this was no ordinary day. This was the moment his festering envy had been building toward for years. All day, he had been pacing his cluttered yard, muttering to himself, replaying every imagined slight, every bitter thought about the ranch owner and his prized quarter horse. Jealousy had taken root so deeply in his heart that it blinded him to reason. He couldn't stand the sight of the horse anymore, the way it grazed peacefully, its every movement a testament to the care and love poured into it. To him, that horse wasn't just an animal, it was a mirror reflecting his own failures. As the last rays of sunlight faded, he made his move. He waited until the cover of darkness enveloped the ranch, his eyes fixed on the dim glow of the barn light. The moon hung high, casting an eerie silver light over the property. The neighbor stood at the edge of the fence, his heart pounding with anticipation and malice. He hadn't thought about what would happen if he got caught, he didn't care. All he wanted was to hurt the ranch owner in the cruelest way he could imagine. With a quick, clumsy motion, he climbed over the fence, landing awkwardly on the other side. He froze for a moment, his breath shallow, ears straining for any sound that might indicate he'd been seen. But the ranch was silent, save for the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. The quarter horse stood near the barn, its sleek chestnut coat catching the faint glow of the moon. It grazed quietly, unaware of the danger creeping toward it. As the neighbor approached, his movements grew more erratic, his breathing heavier. He clenched his fists, his knuckles whitening as anger bubbled to the surface. When he reached the horse, his jealousy exploded into rage. Without warning, he raised his leg and delivered a brutal kick to the horse's flank. The sound of the impact was sharp and violent, cutting through the stillness of the night like a gunshot. The horse stumbled, letting out a startled cry of pain that echoed across the pasture. Its dark, trusting eyes widened in terror, and it backed away, its muscles trembling. But the neighbor wasn't finished. Fueled by years of resentment, he stepped forward again, shouting curses into the night as he struck the horse a second time. This time, the horse reared slightly, its hooves stamping the ground as it tried to escape the attack. The sound of its panic was heartbreaking, a mix of confusion and desperation, as if it couldn't understand why it was being hurt. Unbeknownst to the neighbor, he was not alone. The owner had been sitting on his porch, enjoying the quiet of the evening when the first sound of the attack shattered the peace. He stood abruptly, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and disbelief. Grabbing a flashlight, he stepped into the yard, the beam of light slicing through the darkness as he moved toward the commotion. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. His beloved horse, the animal he had raised and cared for like family, was cowering in fear. The neighbor stood over it, his face twisted with anger, his foot raised for another strike. For a moment, the owner was frozen, his mind struggling to process the scene before him. Then, something inside him snapped. "Get away from my horse," the owner bellowed, his voice booming across the ranch like a thunderclap. The neighbor spun around, startled by the sudden shout. He stumbled back, his bravado faltering as the flashlight's beam landed squarely on his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The owner's expression was one of pure rage, his jaw clenched and his hands trembling with fury. The horse, still trembling, shifted slightly toward its owner, recognizing the voice that had always brought comfort. The owner rushed to its side, gently running his hand along its flank, whispering soothing words even as his anger burned hotter with each passing second. He could feel the horse's muscles quivering beneath his touch, its fear palpable. "How dare you?" the owner said, his voice low and shaking with controlled anger. "What kind of man takes his jealousy out on an innocent animal?" The neighbor stammered, his earlier rage now replaced by a flicker of fear. It wasn't what it looked like," he muttered, his eyes darting nervously toward the fence. "Don't you dare lie to me," the owner snapped, his voice rising. "I saw everything. I heard everything. You think you can come onto my land, hurt my horse, and just walk away?" The neighbor took a step back, his confidence completely gone. He knew there was no way out of this, not with the owner standing before him, his presence towering with a mix of fury and heartbreak. The owner pulled out his phone, his trembling fingers dialing the sheriff's number. "You're going to answer for this," he said, his voice steady but cold. The neighbor didn't argue. He stood silently, his head lowered, as the weight of what he'd done began to sink in. He glanced once more at the horse, now leaning into its owner's touch, and for the first time, he felt a pang of guilt. As the wail of sirens echoed in the distance, the owner remained by his horse's side, his hand never leaving its trembling body. He whispered promises to it, vows that no one would ever hurt it again. But deep down, he knew the scars of this night would linger, for the horse and for himself. When the sheriff arrived, the neighbor was led away without resistance. The owner watched in silence, his focus remaining on the horse. The night was quiet once more, but the peace of the ranch had been shattered, replaced by an ache that would take a long time to heal. As the moon climbed higher into the sky, the owner stayed by the horse's side, stroking its mane and whispering soft reassurances. He vowed to rebuild the trust that had been broken, no matter how long it took. The horse had always been his strength, his partner in life. Now, it was his turn to be the same for it. The night after the attack was suffocating for the ranch owner. He couldn't sleep, couldn't think of anything but the haunting image of his beloved horse recoiling in pain, its trust shattered in a single moment of cruelty. Sitting on the front porch with his head in his hands, he felt a mix of rage, guilt, and heartbreak swirling inside him like a storm. This horse wasn't just an animal, it was a lifeline. For years, it had been his partner, his confidant during quiet nights on the ranch. The rhythmic sound of its hooves on the ground had been his solace after the loss of his father, a reminder of the legacy he was keeping alive. And now, that bond felt violated, as if someone had reached into his soul and torn something sacred apart. The horse stood silently in its stall, its large, dark eyes watching the owner with an unfamiliar nervousness. The sight was unbearable. He stepped closer, gently placing a hand on its flank. It flinched. That small movement, so unlike his horse's usual calm, pierced him deeper than any words could. He whispered softly, his voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I should have protected you." The words felt hollow, but they were all he could offer. He promised himself, and the horse, that he would never let something like this happen again. But promises alone weren't enough. This wasn't just about vengeance, it was about justice. The neighbor's actions couldn't be ignored. The man had crossed a line, and the owner knew he had to act, not in anger, but with purpose. He grabbed a notebook from his desk, sitting at the kitchen table as the hours ticked by. Every detail of the night was scrawled onto the pages, the sound of the kick, the horse's panicked cry, the neighbor's hateful curses. The images replayed in his mind, each one more vivid than the last. He wanted to forget, but he couldn't, because forgetting would mean letting his neighbor off the hook. Morning broke over the ranch, painting the fields in soft gold. But the beauty of the scene did little to ease the weight in the owner's chest. After feeding the horse and checking its injuries again, he drove into town to visit the sheriff's office. The sheriff, a no-nonsense man in his late 50s, listened attentively as the owner recounted the incident. His jaw tightened as the story unfolded, and by the time the owner finished, the room felt heavy with unspoken anger. "This isn't the first time I've heard complaints about him," the sheriff said, leaning back in his chair. "But if this goes to court, we'll need solid evidence. Not just your word against his." The owner nodded grimly. "I'll get it," he said. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he clenched them into fists. Back at the ranch, the owner began putting a plan into action. He wasn't going to let his neighbor get away with this, not again. He installed security cameras around the property, ensuring every corner of the ranch was under watch. The expense was high, but he didn't care. Nothing mattered more than protecting his horse and holding the neighbor accountable. Over the next few days, he began talking to his other neighbors. He wanted to know if anyone else had noticed strange behavior or had suspicions about the man. Most were reluctant to get involved, but one elderly woman who often walked her dog near the ranch hesitated before speaking. "I've seen him near your fence a few times," she admitted, her brow furrowed. "At night. I thought it was strange, but I didn't think much of it. Now, I wish I'd said something." Her words sent a chill through him. The neighbor hadn't just lashed out in a fit of anger, he had been watching, waiting, planning. The thought made the owner's skin crawl. He thanked her and assured her that her observations would help. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the owner stood by the barn, watching his horse graze in the pasture. The cameras were set up, and his notes were growing longer by the day. But the weight in his chest hadn't lifted. The pain in his horse's eyes, the way it flinched when he approached, was a constant reminder of the violation they had both suffered. He sat on the fence, staring out at the fields, and let his mind wander back to the day he had first brought the horse home. It had been a wild, spirited creature, full of energy and mistrust. But over the years, they had built something unshakable. The horse had learned to trust him, to see him as a protector. And in return, the horse had given him more than he could ever repay: loyalty, companionship, and a sense of purpose. The flashbacks brought tears to his eyes. The bond they had forged felt unbreakable, and yet, in one violent moment, the neighbor had managed to crack it. But those cracks wouldn't become permanent. He would make sure of that. The ranch was quiet that night, but the tension lingered in the air. The owner knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Confronting the neighbor, gathering evidence, and pursuing justice would take time and courage. But he was prepared to do whatever it took to protect the horse and restore what had been stolen from them both. The next morning brought a renewed sense of purpose. The owner stood on the porch, his gaze fixed on the horizon as the sun climbed into the sky. The warmth of the day did little to soothe him, but he channeled his emotions into action. He had spent the previous night rereading his notes, organizing every detail about the incident. Now, he was ready to take the next steps. The neighbor had always been careful to stay just within the limits of plausible deniability. The petty sabotage, the muttered insults, they had been easy to brush off in the past. But this time, there was no room for ambiguity. The owner knew that if he wanted justice, he needed undeniable proof and a strategy that left no stone unturned. First, he reviewed the footage from the newly installed security cameras. Though they hadn't captured the initial attack, he hoped they might provide some evidence of the neighbor's previous trespasses. As he scrolled through the recordings, his suspicions were confirmed. On multiple nights, the cameras showed the neighbor loitering near the fence, his silhouette visible against the faint moonlight. Sometimes he paced, other times, he appeared to be muttering to himself. The owner saved the clips, labeling each one carefully. His next step was to gather more testimonies. He returned to the elderly neighbor who had mentioned seeing the man near the fence. This time, she was more forthcoming, perhaps encouraged by the owner's determination. "I remember one night last month," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "I was walking my dog when I saw him standing by the fence with a flashlight. It didn't seem right, but I didn't want to get involved." Her words added another piece to the puzzle, and the owner made sure to write down every detail. He thanked her again, promising to keep her out of any direct confrontation. Over the next few days, the owner continued to build his case. He contacted the sheriff's office again, sharing the new footage and testimonies. The sheriff nodded approvingly as he reviewed the evidence. "This is good," he said. "But we'll need to tie it directly to the night of the attack. Keep documenting everything." At home, the owner spent hours in the barn, tending to his horse. It had been days since the incident, but the horse's nervousness lingered. Every time he approached, the horse would flinch ever so slightly before settling under his touch. It broke his heart to see the animal he had raised from a foal so shaken. He thought back to the early days of their bond. The horse had been skittish at first, a spirited creature that didn't trust easily. It had taken months of patience, gentle words, slow movements, and endless care, to earn its trust. Over time, the horse had become his most reliable companion, always greeting him with a nudge or a soft whinny. Those memories were a stark contrast to the fear he now saw in its eyes, a reminder of what had been taken from them both. One evening, as he stood by the fence watching the horse graze, the owner felt a surge of resolve. His anger hadn't faded, but it had transformed into something sharper, more focused. This wasn't just about punishing the neighbor, it was about restoring the trust and peace that had been shattered. He decided to confront the neighbor directly, but not without preparation. Before heading over, he set his phone to record, ensuring he captured every word of the interaction. He walked across the fields with steady steps, his mind racing through all the things he wanted to say. When the neighbor opened the door, his expression was a mix of surprise and defiance. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone sharp. The owner didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the silence hang in the air. Then, with a voice that was calm but firm, he said, "We need to talk about what you did." The neighbor's eyes flickered with something, fear, perhaps, or guilt, but he quickly masked it with indignation. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, crossing his arms. "I think you do," the owner replied, his gaze unwavering. "I've got footage of you trespassing. I've got witnesses who've seen you near my property. And I was there that night, I saw what you did to my horse." For a moment, the neighbor didn't say anything. The color drained from his face, but he forced a sneer. "You don't have proof of anything," he said, though his voice wavered. The owner took a step closer, his presence towering. "I don't need your confession. I've already given everything to the sheriff. They'll be handling it from here. The neighbor's bravado crumbled. He took a step back, his shoulders slumping as he realized the weight of the evidence stacked against him. For the first time, he looked less like the smug, bitter man the owner had always known and more like a child caught in a lie. As the confrontation ended, the owner walked away, his steps slow but steady. He didn't feel victorious, not yet. There was still work to be done, still trust to rebuild with his horse. But for the first time since that terrible night, he felt a glimmer of hope. The ranch was quiet as he returned, the stars shining overhead like silent witnesses to his journey. He stood by the barn for a long time, watching his horse graze in the moonlight. "We'll get through this," he murmured, more to himself than to the horse. "We'll get through it together." The setting sun bathed the ranch in hues of orange and gold, casting long shadows across the rolling fields. The evening air was heavy, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint rustle of leaves. It should have been a peaceful scene, but the tension in the air was palpable. The owner stood near the barn, his face hardened with determination. Tonight, there would be no more waiting, no more silence. It was time to confront the man who had shattered the peace of his home. The horse grazed nearby, its once trusting eyes still carrying traces of fear. The owner glanced at it, drawing strength from the bond they shared. He took a deep breath and began walking toward the neighbor's property, each step firm and deliberate. As he approached the weathered house, the neighbor was sitting on his porch, a beer bottle in hand. He looked up, his expression shifting from mild surprise to thinly veiled irritation. "What do you want now?" the neighbor called out, his voice dripping with disdain. The owner stopped at the edge of the porch, his eyes locking onto the man before him. "We need to talk," he said, his tone low but steady. The neighbor smirked and leaned back in his chair. "Talk? About what? You've already run to the sheriff with your little story." The owner didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled out his phone and tapped the screen, playing a video clip. The sound of the neighbor's voice filled the air, unmistakably cursing as he stood near the fence, a flashlight in hand. The grainy footage showed him muttering angrily and pacing along the property line. The neighbor's smirk faltered. "So what? That doesn't prove anything," he said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. The owner didn't respond. He swiped to another clip, this one showing the neighbor climbing over the fence on a different night. "That's trespassing," the owner said, his voice sharp. "And that's just the start." The neighbor stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden porch. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he snapped, his face red with anger. "You and your damn horse, acting like you own the world." The words hit the owner like a slap, but he kept his composure. "This isn't about me being better than you," he said. "This is about what you did. You hurt my horse. You crossed a line, and you know it." For a moment, the neighbor said nothing. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his fists clenched at his sides. Then, like a dam breaking, the words spilled out. "You don't get it," he said, his voice cracking. "You've got everything. This ranch, that horse, people who respect you. And what do I have? Nothing." The owner was taken aback by the rawness of the confession. He had always known the neighbor was bitter, but hearing the depth of his envy was startling. "You think that gives you the right to take it out on my horse?" the owner asked, his voice rising. "That horse didn't do anything to you. It's an innocent animal, and you—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence without his voice breaking. The neighbor sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumping. "I didn't mean to hurt it," he mumbled, though the words felt hollow. I don't know what I was thinking." The owner took a step closer, his anger giving way to something more complex. "You didn't think," he said, his voice soft but firm. "That's the problem. You let your jealousy control you, and now my horse is scared of people. Do you even realize what you've done?" The neighbor looked away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The bravado that had always defined him was gone, replaced by a vulnerability the owner had never seen before. "I'm sorry," the neighbor said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was angry, and I didn't know how to handle it." The words hung in the air, carrying the weight of regret and missed opportunities. For the first time, the owner saw the man not as a bitter rival, but as someone who was deeply, profoundly broken. But understanding didn't erase the damage. The owner shook his head. "Sorry isn't enough," he said. "You need to face the consequences of what you've done. You owe it to me, to my horse, and to yourself to make this right." The neighbor nodded slowly, his expression grim. "What happens now?" he asked. "The sheriff will decide that," the owner said. "But I suggest you think long and hard about how you're going to fix this. Apologizing is a start, but it's not the end." As the conversation ended, the owner turned and walked away, his steps heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. The confrontation had been emotionally draining, but it was necessary. Justice was important, but so was understanding the pain that had driven the neighbor to act the way he had. When he returned to the ranch, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the stars were beginning to appear. He stood by the barn, watching his horse graze under the faint glow of the security lights. "We did it," he said softly, as though speaking to the horse. "It's not over yet, but we're on our way." The horse looked up briefly, its dark eyes meeting his. For the first time in days, the fear seemed to have lessened, replaced by a glimmer of the trust they had worked so hard to build. The owner knew the road ahead would be long, but he was ready to face it. Together, he and his horse would rebuild what had been broken, one step at a time. The days following the confrontation were marked by a whirlwind of activity. The sheriff's office, armed with the evidence the owner had painstakingly gathered, formally charged the neighbor with trespassing and animal cruelty. The news spread quickly through the small community, leaving the neighbor with little room to hide from the judgment of his peers. The owner hadn't sought to humiliate the man, but the consequences of his actions were unavoidable. At the local market, whispers followed the neighbor wherever he went. People who had once tolerated his gruff demeanor now avoided him entirely, their disapproval etched clearly on their faces. He had become an outcast, his envy and cruelty exposed for all to see. Despite the sense of justice, the owner found no joy in the neighbor's downfall. The bitterness and rage he had felt on that terrible night had dulled, replaced by a quieter determination to move forward. Justice had been served, but the emotional wounds, both his and his horse's, would take far longer to heal. The legal proceedings were straightforward. The neighbor pleaded guilty, his earlier defiance giving way to resignation. He was fined heavily, ordered to pay restitution for the harm he had caused, and sentenced to community service at a local animal shelter. The irony of his punishment wasn't lost on the owner, but he hoped that working with animals might teach the neighbor a sense of empathy he had clearly been lacking. With the legal battle resolved, the owner turned his focus back to the ranch. The security cameras remained in place, their presence a constant reminder of the ordeal. The owner couldn't help but feel a pang of unease every time he saw the blinking lights, a reminder that his sanctuary had been violated. But he refused to let fear dictate his life. Instead, he poured his energy into caring for his horse. Each day, he spent hours with it, speaking in soft tones and moving with deliberate gentleness. The horse had started to relax again, its trust slowly returning, but there were still moments of hesitation, a flinch at an unexpected noise, a wary glance when approached too quickly. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the owner sat by the fence, watching the horse graze. The sight brought a rare moment of peace. He remembered the early days of their bond, when the horse had been a spirited and untamed creature. It had taken time and patience to build trust back then, and it would take the same now. The community, too, began to rally around the owner. Neighbors who had once been distant now stopped by the ranch, offering their support. One man even helped reinforce the fence, ensuring it would be harder for anyone to trespass in the future. Their gestures, small as they were, reminded the owner that he wasn't alone. As the days turned into weeks, the ranch began to feel like home again. The scars of the incident remained, but they no longer felt insurmountable. The owner found solace in the routines of ranch life, the rhythm of feeding the animals, the earthy scent of hay, the quiet companionship of his horse. As the weeks turned into months, the ranch owner began to notice small but meaningful signs of healing. His horse, once skittish and wary, now approached him with a cautious but growing confidence. The deep wounds of mistrust were beginning to close, though their memory lingered like faint shadows. One evening, the owner decided to take a significant step toward restoring normalcy. He opened the gate to the larger pasture, allowing the horse to roam freely across the expansive fields. It was the first time since the incident that the horse had been given such freedom, and for a moment, it hesitated, its ears flicking nervously as it glanced back at its owner. "It's okay," the owner said softly, leaning on the fence. "You're safe now. Go on." The horse took a tentative step, then another. Slowly, its stride grew more confident, and soon it was galloping across the open field, its mane streaming in the breeze. Watching it run, the owner felt a lump rise in his throat. This was the horse he remembered, strong, free, and full of life. The sight was like a balm to his soul, washing away the lingering pain of that terrible night. The neighbor, meanwhile, was living a far different reality. His time at the animal shelter had forced him to confront the consequences of his actions in ways he hadn't anticipated. Cleaning stalls and feeding animals might have seemed like simple tasks, but they carried a deeper weight for someone who had harmed a creature out of spite. One day, the neighbor showed up at the ranch unannounced. The owner, seeing him approach, felt his stomach tighten. He hadn't seen the man since the legal proceedings had concluded, and he wasn't sure he wanted to now. The neighbor stopped a few feet from the fence, his head bowed. I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The owner didn't respond immediately. He studied the man before him, noting the weariness in his eyes and the way his hands fidgeted nervously. It was clear that the neighbor's pride had been stripped away, leaving only a man trying to make amends. "Sorry doesn't fix what you did," the owner said finally, his voice firm but not unkind. "I know," the neighbor replied. "I can't take it back, but I'm trying to be better. The shelter work, it's taught me a lot." The owner nodded slowly. He didn't forgive the man, not fully, not yet. But he saw the glimmer of change, and for now, that was enough. As the neighbor turned to leave, the owner called out, "You hurt my horse. You hurt me. But if you're serious about being better, don't let this be the end of it." The neighbor paused, nodded, and walked away without another word. Back at the barn that evening, the owner stood beside his horse, stroking its mane as the sun set behind the hills. The warmth of the day lingered, and the air was filled with the soft hum of crickets. The ranch, once a place of pain and tension, was beginning to feel like home again. The horse leaned into his touch, a gesture of trust that brought a faint smile to the owner's face. "We've been through a lot, haven't we?" he murmured. "But we made it." The quiet strength of the moment reminded him of why he had fought so hard. The ranch wasn't just a place, it was a sanctuary, a home for both him and the horse. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, he knew they would face them together. As the last light of day faded into twilight, the horse trotted off to graze, its movements confident and free. The owner watched it go, his heart lighter than it had been in months. Healing wasn't instant, and scars would always remain. But in that moment, surrounded by the peace of the ranch and the quiet companionship of his horse, the owner felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. The ranch was quiet now, the chaos of the past months fading into memory. The golden light of sunset blanketed the fields, and the gentle rustle of leaves in the evening breeze carried a sense of calm that had long been absent. The horse stood at the edge of the pasture, its chestnut coat gleaming in the light, its posture confident and free once again. The owner leaned against the fence, watching his companion with a deep sense of gratitude. This horse wasn't just an animal, it was a symbol of resilience, trust, and the enduring bond that had carried them both through the darkest of times. Their relationship had been tested, fractured by cruelty and jealousy, but it had emerged stronger. He thought back to the night of the attack, the pain and fear in the horse's eyes, and his own sense of helplessness. Those moments had been unbearable, a violation of the peace they had shared. But they had survived. Together, they had faced the storm and found a way through. The scars were still there, but they were reminders of strength rather than weakness. The neighbors' actions had shaken the foundations of the ranch, but they had also brought clarity. They had reminded the owner of the importance of vigilance, of standing up for what mattered most. The neighbor may have tried to break the horse's spirit, but in doing so, he had only deepened the bond between horse and owner, a bond built on trust, love, and respect. As he reflected, the owner's mind turned to a larger truth. The incident wasn't just about one man's envy or one horse's pain. It was about something greater, the way animals and humans are intertwined, the way they depend on each other in ways that often go unspoken but are deeply felt. Animals, especially those like his horse, gave so much: companionship, loyalty, and even a sense of purpose. They asked for so little in return, just kindness and care. The owner's resolve hardened as he thought about this. He would dedicate himself to ensuring that what had happened here would serve as a lesson, not just for the neighbor, but for the community. Respect for animals wasn't optional, it was a responsibility, one that every person shared. He turned back to the horse, watching it trot across the field with an ease that filled his heart. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Every moment of patience, every act of care had brought them back to this place of peace. As the last light of the day faded into twilight, the owner whispered to himself, "We're stronger now, aren't we?" The horse flicked its ears in response, as if understanding the sentiment. The neighbor's envy had tried to tear them apart, but it had failed. In the end, the bond between the horse and its owner was unshakable, a testament to the power of love, resilience, and respect.